the heart of a calm and beautiful African village, where life moved slowly and traditions were respected, there lived a man named Obasi. To the outside world, he was a dream come true, tall, well-spoken, and always dressed in the finest robes. He ran a successful business, donated to the local temple, and never raised his voice in public. Whenever he passed by, villagers greeted him with admiration. Mothers whispered to their daughters about what a perfect husband he would be, and elders praised his wisdom. But underneath that perfect image was something no one could see, something deeply twisted. Obasi had a strange pattern. Every few years, he would choose a bride from a nearby village. The wedding would be grand and colourful, filled with music, dancing, and laughter. He would smile lovingly at his bride, hold her hand, and promise her the world. But after the celebrations ended, silence would fall, and soon the bride would disappear. At first, people thought it was bad luck. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she couldn't handle marriage. But as time passed, and wife after wife vanished, whispers began, quiet ones, dangerous ones. Still, Obasi always had a story ready. She wasn't happy, he would say, sighing. She missed her family, or she left in the night. I tried to stop her. His voice was always calm, his eyes filled with just the right amount of sadness. And because of his wealth and influence, people chose to believe him. No one dared look deeper. No one asked why the curtains of his mansion were always shut, or why no servant was ever allowed near the back of the house. Some of the older villagers began to feel something was wrong, but they stayed silent. No proof, no answers, just a man who kept smiling and a trail of missing brides behind him. Behind the flawless beauty of Obasi's grand mansion, where polished floors gleamed and every corner smelled of sweet incense, there was a dark, forbidden space that no guest ever saw, a place that no servant dared go near. Hidden behind a towering bookshelf in his private study was a secret latch. When pulled, it opened to a narrow stone staircase that twisted downward into a darkness so thick it felt alive. This wasn't just a basement. It was a cage built for silence, fear, and death. It was Obasi's personal prison, his secret kingdom of nightmares. Every time Obasi brought a new wife home, the village saw love. They saw celebration, tradition, and joy. But behind closed doors, his new bride was never taken to a honeymoon bed or held in warm arms. Instead, she was offered a drink, always poured by Obasi himself, mixed with a strange, bitter powder that dulled the senses and blurred her vision. By the time she realized something was wrong, it was too late. Her body would go weak, her head dizzy, and her breath shallow. Obasi would gently lift her, smiling, carrying her down the cold steps into his hidden world. When each woman woke up, they were no longer a bride, they were a prisoner, their arms chained to the stone wall, the metal biting into their skin. The room was damp and icy, the walls were covered in old stains, and the only sound was the slow drip of water from a rusty pipe above. There was no sunlight, no clock, no comfort, only darkness, fear, and silence. Each new bride would cry at first, calling his name, begging for help, believing there must be a mistake. But when Obasi finally returned, they saw the truth in his eyes. There was no mistake. He was the monster. Under the influence of heavy drugs and his own twisted mind, Obasi would transform. He would laugh at their fear, pace the room with wild eyes, and then, when his madness took full control, he would hurt them. Sometimes he would scream, blaming them for his pain. Other times he would go quiet and simply watch them cry. It wasn't always quick. He would stretch the pain over days, sometimes weeks. He studied suffering, and when he was finally done, when their bodies could no longer fight, he would dispose of them like broken toys. But he didn't bury them in the yard or toss them into the river like some criminals might. No, Obasi had created a secret chamber, deeper within the basement, a place only he could access, hidden behind a false wall. He had dug the space himself when the house was first built, covering the walls with thick layers of concrete and keeping it sealed with a custom lock. One by one, he placed their bodies inside. He arranged them carefully, some wrapped in cloth, others left in the exact position they died. To him, they weren't people anymore. They were reminders of control, power. He would visit them sometimes, even speak to them. Over the years, 5 women were taken, 5 lives erased from the world above. Their families waited for word. Their friends whispered and wondered. But Obasi always had a soft lie on his tongue. She ran away. She was not well. She left in the middle of the night, and the village, still enchanted by his charm and wealth, never looked deeper. The police never searched. No one asked questions. No one suspected the perfect man with the perfect smile. But the basement remembered. The walls soaked in screams. The floor stained with history. And though the dead do not breathe, their presence began to live on in that dark space. Cold winds brushed through sealed doors. Whispers echoed where there should have been silence. Shadows moved without light. The space was turning haunted. Obasi didn't know it yet, but the basement he used to destroy others was starting to turn on him. Something unseen had awakened, something waiting. And when the next bride came, the one he thought would be just like the rest, the basement would no longer stay silent. Obasi believed he had full control, but what he built beneath his home was no longer just his secret. It had become a graveyard, a shrine of rage, a trap of his own making, and soon the hunter would become the hunted. As the years passed in the quiet village, a strange pattern began to take shape, one that was noticed, but never truly questioned. Obasi, the wealthy and charming man everyone admired, had married not one, not two, but 5 different women over time. Each marriage was grand and full of celebration. The village would gather with drums and dancing, wearing their best clothes and singing songs late into the night. People would cheer Obasi and his new bride, offering blessings and gifts, believing each time that this was the one who would finally settle down with him for life. But something always happened. After every wedding, after the music had faded and the smiles were gone, the bride would disappear. At first, it would start with a few missed market days. She must be resting, people would say. Then a few more days would go by. No one saw her hanging laundry, or watering the garden, or walking by the river like new brides often did. Concern would grow and someone would eventually ask Obasi about it. But his answers were always calm, always believable. He never shouted or panicked. He'd lower his voice and say things like, "She wasn't happy, she left in the night," or "She missed her family too much, so she went back home." He'd smile gently and shake his head, pretending to be hurt. "Some people aren't made for marriage," he'd say with a sigh, and the village believed him. How could they not? He was the perfect man. He had power, money, and spoke with the kind of confidence that made people trust him without doubt. Besides, there was never any blood, never any screaming, never any proof. The women were simply gone, vanished, without a trace. No goodbye letters, no belongings packed. It was like they had been swallowed by the earth itself. But Obasi's house still stood strong and beautiful on the hill, and he continued to greet the villagers with a friendly wave. His clothes always neat, his voice always kind. The first bride's disappearance was a shock, but people gave him sympathy. Maybe she really did leave, they said. Maybe she was too young. When the second bride vanished, some eyebrows raised, but Obasi had already prepared a softer excuse. He claimed she had mental health struggles and couldn't handle village life. The third time, he told people she had run off with another man. "I'm heartbroken," he said, and everyone believed his sad eyes. By the time the 4th and 5th brides were gone, the village had become numb to it. They whispered among themselves, but no one confronted him. He was too respected, too polished, and maybe deep down, no one wanted to believe something darker was happening. The older women in the village sometimes talked behind closed doors. They said something wasn't right. "No woman just disappears without a trace," one would whisper. But when it came time to speak out, they stayed silent. Obasi was too powerful, and fear hung like smoke in the air. It was easier to accept the lies than dig for the truth. Some of the younger men admired him even more. "He's just unlucky in love," they'd say. "Women don't know how to handle a real man like him." His status grew. Even with the mystery of the missing wives, Obasi remained untouchable. No one dared search his home. No one filed a report. No family member ever came looking. Obasi had made sure of that. But the village couldn't shake the unease. The weddings had stopped. No new bride, had been seen in years. The mansion on the hill became quieter and more distant. The windows were always shut, and strange sounds were heard at night. A few children claimed they saw something moving behind the curtains. Others said they heard crying, but their parents told them to hush. It wasn't their place to speak of such things. Still, the whispers never truly stopped. They clung to the wind, slipped through the trees, and curled beneath doorways. People said the ground around Obasi's house felt colder, that the birds never landed on his roof. They said, when he passed by now, there was something hollow in his smile. The same man who once brought joy now carried shadows behind his eyes. 5 women, 5 weddings, 5 disappearances, no answers. And still, Obasi walked freely among them, untouched, unbothered. But the village, though silent, was starting to change. Whispers were growing louder, and somewhere deep in the heart of it all, a storm was beginning to rise, one that even Obasi couldn't charm his way out of. Tashala was not like the others. She was strong, smart, and had a fire in her spirit that no one could dim. She grew up in a nearby village, raised by a hard-working mother and a younger brother she loved more than anything. Life was never easy, but Tashala had learned to fight her own battle. People in her village respected her. She spoke with confidence, and her eyes held stories of pain, survival, and strength. So when Obasi came to her village with gifts and smiles, asking for her hand in marriage, she knew something was wrong. Obasi looked perfect on the outside. He was handsome, polite, and carried himself like a king. He spoke with charm, offered wealth, and promised to take care of Tashala's family forever. But when Tashala looked into his eyes, she felt a coldness, like staring into a deep well with no bottom. There was no light there, no love, only something hidden, something dangerous. She didn't trust him, not even for a moment. But her mother was getting older. Her brother needed schooling, and the money Obasi offered could change their lives. So with a heavy heart, Tashala agreed. The wedding was beautiful, colourful fabrics, music that made the air dance, and people from every corner of the village came to celebrate. Tashala wore red and gold, her head held high, even though her heart beat fast with fear. Obasi smiled at her all day, holding her hand gently, whispering sweet words. But behind that smile, she could feel the control, the way he watched her, not with love, but with possession, like she was a prize, not a partner. After the wedding, Obasi took her to his mansion, the same grand house where his other wives had lived. Tashala felt a chill the moment she stepped through the doors. The air felt heavy, like it was hiding secrets. The walls seemed to watch her. Servants were quiet, their eyes always on the ground, never meeting hers. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but she said nothing. Not yet. She needed to understand him, watch him, find his weakness. That night, he gave her a drink, just like he had with all the others. But Tashala was clever. She had seen the way his hands trembled slightly as he poured it. She remembered the warnings from a strange old woman in her village who told her, "Beware the wine of the snake," with a smile. Tashala pretended to sip it, smiling sweetly, while pouring most of it into a plant behind her. Obasi didn't notice. He led her to the bedroom, but she stayed awake the entire night, pretending to sleep, listening to every sound. She heard him go downstairs, heard a strange creaking sound, like a hidden door opening, then footsteps going deeper into the house, a long silence, then footsteps again. When he returned, he stared at her sleeping form for a long time. She kept her breathing slow and steady, even though her heart was racing. Over the next few days, Tashala began to understand the truth. She explored the house carefully, making mental notes of the locked doors, the quiet halls, the way the servants avoided the basement. She noticed a thick iron key Obasi always kept around his neck. She saw bruises on one servant girl's arm, and worst of all, she found a small earring behind a curtain in the guest room, a delicate gold piece with a name etched on it. Not hers, someone else's, one of the women before her. Tashala felt the fear grow inside her, but she also felt something else, anger. She knew now she was in danger. Obasi wasn't just cruel, he was hiding something terrible. But she wouldn't run, she wouldn't cry, she would wait, watch, learn. And when the time was right, she would not just survive, she would fight back. To the outside world, Tashala was just another bride, another name in the list. But behind her calm smile was a woman who refused to be a victim. And while Obasi believed she would fall like the rest, he didn't know she was nothing like the others. Tashala had walked into the lion's den, but the lion didn't know she had teeth of her own. The night had fallen quiet, and the stars above the mansion flickered like tiny warning lights in the sky. Inside the house, the music from the wedding had faded, the guests had gone, and Obasi walked slowly through the hallways, guiding Tashala toward what he claimed would be their private place. His hand was firm on her back, but his smile was soft, too soft, like silk covering a blade. She followed without protest, dressed in her wedding gown, her footsteps steady. He took her to his private study, where a large bookshelf stood like a wall. With one smooth move, he slid a hidden latch, and the bookshelf creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. He looked at her, expecting fear, but Tashala simply blinked, her face calm. "After you," he whispered. She stepped down without hesitation. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were rough stone, and the only sound was the echo of their footsteps. Obasi held a lantern, its flickering light barely touching the damp basement walls. Tashala saw scratch marks on the sides, rusted chains, and a heavy metal door ahead. Still, she said nothing. She just kept walking, her heart pounding, but her mind sharp. Once inside the room, he turned to her. "You won't leave this place," he said, his voice suddenly low, stripped of charm. Like the others, he raised a chain, thick and cold, and latched it to her wrist, locking it to the wall. "Cry," he said, as if it pleased him. "Beg," but she didn't cry. She sat down slowly, leaning back against the wall, and looked straight into his eyes. Her silence unsettled. Obasi was used to fear, screams, panic, but Tashala didn't give him any of that. Her face was calm. Her eyes didn't blink. She just stared at him, like she was studying something. He tilted his head. "You're different," he murmured. "You're not afraid." She didn't answer, and that silence echoed louder than any scream. Obasi stayed for a while, pacing, talking to himself, drinking from a small flask. Tashala noticed how his hands trembled when he drank, how his eyes twitched, and how the shadows in the room seemed to dance around him. He was not as strong as he wanted the world to believe. There was madness in him, but there was also weakness, and she could see it now. He left her there, just like he had done to the other brides, locking the door behind him. The sound of the key turning echoed like thunder in the small space. But Tashala didn't panic. She waited. She studied the walls, the lock, the rhythm of his footsteps. She listened carefully to everything. Time passed. Hours, maybe more. But Tashala didn't waste a single second. When Obasi returned the next day, expecting to see a broken woman, he found her exactly where he left her, awake, alert, watching him again. No tears, no begging, just quiet strength, and something about that unnerved him. He yelled at her, threw things, tried to scare her, but she didn't flinch. In that cold, dark basement, the same trap had been set, but this time it had caught the wrong prey. Tashala wasn't there to be broken. She was there to break him. Obasi had done this so many times before, thinking he was always in control. But he couldn't see that the trap wasn't just repeating, it was starting to turn on him. Tashala wasn't just surviving, she was planning. The basement was silent, but not empty. As Tashala sat against the cold stone wall, her eyes wandered across the shadows. The dim light that slipped through a small crack above barely reached the corners of the room. Her wrists still chained, she shifted slowly, carefully, feeling every inch of the space around her. And then she saw it, tiny scratches on the wall, barely noticeable at first. She moved closer, squinting in the low light. Her fingers ran along the marks. These were not random, they were letters, words, names. She looked around and began to see more. On every wall, messages had been carved into the stone with whatever sharp object the women could find. Some names were clear, written with strength. Others were shaky, almost like whispers left behind. "I was here. Help me. He lies. My name is Salima. I will never be forgotten." Tashala's heart tightened as she touched the words. These were the voices of the women who came before her, the brides who had disappeared, the ones the village forgot. But here, in this dark place, their stories lived on. As Tashala traced the messages, something strange began to happen. A chill passed through her body, not from the cold, but from something deeper. She began to feel them, not see, not hear in the usual way, but feel, like whispers brushing past her ears, like the warmth of a hand on her shoulder. She closed her eyes and breathed slowly, and then she felt it stronger, soft, broken voices in her mind, calling out, "You are not alone. Be strong." He must be stopped. Tashala opened her eyes, tears filling them. She wasn't imagining this. She could feel their pain, their fear, but also their hope. Each message on the wall was a thread connecting her to them. They had suffered like her, cried like her, waited like her, but none had made it out. Still, they had not given up. Even in their final hours, they left these messages, hoping someone, anyone, would read them. And now, Tashala had. It gave her strength. She ran her fingers over each name, each message, whispering them softly. "I see you, Zuwena. I hear you, Abeni. I will not let your deaths be forgotten." With each name she spoke, she felt less afraid. The walls no longer felt like a prison, but like a room full of voices standing with her. The darkness no longer seemed endless. She was no longer just one woman chained in a basement. She was the living memory of every woman who had suffered here. And with that, a fire sparked in her heart. She looked at the walls again, this time not just as a victim, but as a fighter. The messages weren't just cries, they were clues. She noticed symbols near the floor, arrows pointing toward a crack in the corner. A small rock had been loosened. With effort, she leaned forward and used her bare fingers to pull it free. Behind it, hidden deep, was a rusted nail. Someone had left it there, maybe for escape, maybe as a weapon. Tashala clutched it in her hand, the sharp metal biting her skin, reminding her that she still had time and she still had fight. The voices inside her grew louder, stronger, not of fear now, but of defiance. "You are the one," they whispered. "Finish what we could not." Tashala looked toward the door, her eyes steady. She had the strength of many behind her now, and Obasi, he had no idea what was coming. Obasi thought he still had control. Each night, he came into the basement with his usual cruel smirk, holding his flask filled with strange-smelling liquid. He would mutter to himself, sometimes laugh, sometimes growl, in a language Tashala couldn't understand. His hands shook more than before, and his eyes darted around the room like he was being watched. But Tashala said nothing. She kept her eyes low, her face calm, but inside she was watching everything. She could see the change starting in him. The once confident man who walked like a king now looked like a hunted animal. The basement that had always been his place of power was no longer silent. The spirits of the women he had chained, beaten, and killed were rising. Their presence was growing stronger each day. Tashala could feel them too. Cold winds where there were no windows, soft whispers in the middle of the night, shadows moving when Obasi's back was turned, and he was starting to feel them too. He would stop suddenly and shout into the darkness, "Who's there?" He'd swing his lantern at nothing. Sometimes he'd trip, screaming at shadows. His mutterings turned into loud arguments with voices only he could hear. "You're dead! You can't touch me!" he'd yell, but the fear in his voice betrayed him. The past was finally catching up with him, and Tashala could see the cracks forming in his mind. One night, he came in with wide eyes and trembling hands. "They're trying to drive me mad," he whispered, "but I won't let them." He turned toward Tashala and pointed his finger. "You brought them. You witch!" he shouted. Tashala flinched, not from fear, but from excitement. He was losing it. The man who had caused so much pain was unraveling. Tashala began to play along, staying quiet, but watching him with just enough suspicion to make him nervous. She whispered to herself sometimes, not real words, just sounds, enough to make him think she knew more than she let on. When he asked what she said, she just smiled faintly and looked away. It drove him deeper into his panic. The basement no longer belonged to him. The The spirits moved around freely now. Doors slammed shut on their own. Cold air burst through the cracks. The chain on Tashala's wrist rattled without being touched. Obasi tried to act strong, but every time he walked into that room, his steps grew smaller, slower, like he feared the very walls. And Tashala, still chained, sat tall and silent, no longer his prisoner, but something far more dangerous, his witness, and now his judge. He had no idea that the one woman he thought he had power over was now waiting for the perfect moment. The house was turning against him. The voices of the dead were growing louder, and Tashala was ready to finish what they all started. The basement was colder than ever that night. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of damp stone and something older, something bitter. Obasi hadn't come down for hours. Tashala knew his pattern now. He was upstairs, drunk and stumbling, trapped in another round of hallucinations. The spirits had almost fully broken him. He mumbled to himself louder each day, begged for forgiveness when no one was there, and screamed at shadows only he could see. Tashala sat still, her fingers gently moving toward her hair. She had waited patiently for this moment. Hidden deep in the coils of her braids was a tiny metal pin, just sharp enough, just thin enough to slip into the lock on her chain. It had taken days of practice, turning the pin with quiet determination whenever Obasi left. Tonight, she felt the click. The cuff popped open. She didn't move at first. She just stared at her wrist, the mark of the metal still fresh on her skin. And then she smiled, softly, just for herself. She stood up slowly. Her legs trembled from days of sitting, but her mind was sharp. Every step toward the basement door was careful, silent. She picked up the rusted nail she had hidden behind the stone earlier, just in case. Then, like a shadow, she slipped up the stairs and through the hidden panel into the hallway. The mansion was dark. The wind howled outside. Obasi's voice echoed faintly from the main room. He was shouting again, this time at the air. "I said I'm sorry. I didn't mean to," he cried, crawling on the floor, waving his hands at ghosts that weren't there. "Don't touch me. Leave me alone." Tashala watched from behind the door. The great Obasi, once feared, was now nothing but a man crushed under the weight of his own crime. She stepped into the room quietly. The wooden floor creaked, and he turned, eyes wide with madness. "You," he whispered. "You're not supposed to be out." She didn't speak. She walked slowly toward him, each step steady, powerful. Obasi backed away, whimpering like a child. "They told me. They said you'd come," he muttered, backing into a corner. Tashala raised the nail, but not to strike. Instead, she threw it aside. She didn't need it. "You will not die tonight," she said calmly. "Death is too kind." She moved quickly, grabbing the same chains that once held her and wrapping them around his wrists. He was too weak, too broken to fight back. She dragged him, just like he once dragged his brides, back into the basement. She locked the door from the outside. As he screamed and begged behind the thick metal, Tashala walked away, the voices of the lost women whispering their approval. Justice had come, not with blood, but with the same fear he had given others. Obasi was now the prisoner, and Tashala was finally free. The heavy door slammed shut behind her with a loud, echoing thud. The sound rang through the house like the closing of a final chapter. Obasi was no longer the master of this place. Now, he was the one trapped, chained in the same basement where he had once chained so many innocent women. Tashala stood on the other side of the door, her heart pounding, but not with fear. It pounded with justice, with victory. Inside the dark basement, Obasi's screams filled the air. "Let me out! Please! I'm sorry!" he cried, but his voice bounced off the stone walls, unheard by anyone who would help him. No one came. The mansion was silent, just like the village outside. The same silence that had allowed his evil to go unnoticed for so long now swallowed him whole. But Obasi wasn't truly alone. As the hours passed, the air in the basement changed. It grew colder, heavier. He curled in the corner, his hands trembling. Then he heard it, a faint whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind, but it grew louder. It was a voice, then two, then many. Soft, sorrowful voices, all whispering one name, his name. "Obasi!" they called over and over again. He looked around wildly. "Who's there?" he shouted, but he saw no one, just shadows, just darkness. But the voices didn't stop. They came from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside his own head. Each voice carried pain. Each voice carried rage. Obasi! Then came the laughter. Not joyful laughter, but broken, haunted giggles. The kind that chilled the blood. The spirits were not gone. They had waited for this, and now they surrounded him. Obasi crawled to the wall, the same walls he used to ignore when the women cried for help. Now he scratched at them, begged them. I didn't mean it. I was sick. I didn't know what I was doing. But the spirits didn't answer with mercy. They whispered the names of the women he had killed, one by one. Salima, Abeni, Zuena, Halima. The names echoed through the room, louder and louder, until Obasi covered his ears and screamed, but nothing helped. His mind shattered slowly, like glass cracking under pressure. He begged, cried, clawed at the floor, but no one came. No one was left to believe his lies. No one left to be fooled by his charm. He was forgotten, just like the women he had tried to erase. And outside the basement, Tashala stood beneath the moonlight, the wind in her hair. She looked at the house one last time, then turned her back to it. She didn't need to stay. Justice had already been delivered. The spirits had what they needed. The nightmare was finally over. Obasi's screams faded into the night, becoming part of the very house he once ruled. Now, the basement belonged to him, and the voices he could never escape. No one saw Tashala again after that night. Some said she left before the sun rose, walking into the forest without a single glance back. Others swore they saw her shadow moving through the village, slipping away into the unknown, never to return. But one thing was certain, her story remained. It started as whispers. Women told their daughters in hushed voices about the brave girl who faced the monster and won. Men muttered among themselves, shaken by the fate of the once powerful Obasi. Children gathered near the well, daring each other to say his name 3 times, only to run away screaming. The tale spread like wildfire, twisting and turning in different tongues. But the truth never changed. Tashala was the girl who couldn't be broken, the girl who turned the hunter into the hunted. The mansion on the hill stood silent, but at night, the air around it felt different. The villagers walking home late swore they heard things, low whispers riding the wind, the rattling of chains, and sometimes a single blood-curdling scream. No one dared to go near. Even the bravest men, the ones who used to admire Obasi's wealth and charm, stayed away. The house, once a symbol of power, became a warning. The doors rotted, the walls cracked. The windows, once bright with candlelight, turned into hollow, dark eyes watching the village below. No one stepped foot inside. No one even touched the gates. It was as if the house itself had become a grave. Some nights, when the wind was just right, villagers claimed they could hear voices, women's voices, whispering in the darkness. And sometimes, when the moon was high, a shadow could be seen standing near the mansion's entrance. A tall, still figure, watching. Was it Tashala? No one knew. But one thing was certain. The man who thought he could trap and kill his brides had finally met the one woman he couldn't control. And because of her, the village would never forget.